Now let's talk about some different ways you can store database connection information, and also different ways to authenticate to the database. When you're deploying applications on premises that connect to databases, there's basically two approaches in terms of authenticating the app to the database to retrieve and store data. You could connect using a username and password that's defined in the database, which for SQL Server is called SQL authentication. You'd store the username and password somewhere, probably in your appsettings.json file, and you'd use those credentials when connecting to the database. Or you could use a service account. For Windows deployments, you can configure the application pool on IIS that's running your web app to use a certain Windows account that you've created just for that purpose, and then grant that account access in the database. So all the authentication is taking place using Windows Integrated Authentication. In either case, your application needs to know where to reach the database. And unless you want to hard code that information in your code, you're probably storing the connection info in your appsettings.json file. Then you deploy a different appsettings.json file with your code, depending on which environment you're deploying to, dev, staging, or production. So that's kind of the baseline for understanding database authentication and connection. Deploying to Azure App Service builds on this and also gives us some more options. You've already seen that you can store configuration information on the app service itself using app settings and connection strings in the configuration section of the app service. If these name-value pairs have the same name as a setting in the appsettings.json file that was uploaded with the code, that value will get overridden by the value stored in the app service. That's great for centralizing management, but you might not want your connection strings stored in plain text on the app service for security reasons. Or maybe you want to store all your connection strings in a central location to make management easier. So Azure makes it possible to store your connection string in an Azure Key Vault. Azure Key Vault is a secure store for secrets. You can store keys, passwords, certificates, and assign permissions to certain users to manage those secrets. Then you authorize your app service to access the Key Vault using a managed identity, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then you change the connection string in your app service to point to the secret in your Key Vault. Anyone who can read the configuration information of the app service can't see the username and password for the database because it's stored in a secure Key Vault that they don't have access to. Now, for the app service to access Key Vault, you enable a managed identity for the app service. A managed identity is basically a service account for the app service that's stored in Microsoft Entra ID. It's a security principal that can be granted access to other Azure resources, like Key Vault. Entra ID manages the identity, so you don't have to provision or rotate secrets or store passwords for the managed identity. But what's really great is that because Azure SQL Database is a resource in Azure, if you enable a managed identity for the app service, you can just grant that identity access to the Azure SQL Database. That means you don't even have to store the username and password in Key Vault because they're just not needed. SQL authentication isn't being used. So it's similar to using a service account on premises. You need to run some SQL commands on the database, which I'll show you in the demo. And you still need to store a connection string in the app service so the code knows where to find the database. But authentication is taken care of for you, so it's really powerful. Now, in all these cases, we're storing the connection string in plain text in the configuration section of the app service. Removing the credential information is a step in the right direction, but App Service now has a feature for creating and validating connections. Service Connector allows compute services in Azure to connect to various other services in Azure. Inside the app service here, I can configure a Service Connector connection to things like Cosmo DB, Azure Storage, messaging services like Service Bus and Event Hubs, and databases like MySQL, PostgreSQL, or Azure SQL Database. Instead of having to type in a string, which can be error-prone, you can choose from the actual services in your Azure subscription. You manage all the connections for your app service within the Service Connector tab, including the authentication information. Service Connector also validates and checks the health status of the connection, so you can know if it's broken or not. There are a few different authentication types supported, but some of them require configuration using the Azure command line interface, like authentication using managed identity or a service principal. For connection strings, you can do the configuration right here in the portal, and that includes storing the credentials in Azure Key Vault. The support for connecting your client code to Azure SQL Database using a service connector also depends on the framework of your client. On the documentation page, you can see the client types that are supported for the different authentication types. For .NET clients, all the authentication methods are supported. For PHP and Ruby, only connection strings are supported. In the next clip, let's enable a managed identity for the app service and configure it to authenticate to the Azure SQL Database, which will remove the need for managing authentication information in the app service. Now let's configure a managed identity for the app service and give it permissions to access the Azure SQL Database. Inside the app service here, let's just browse to the deployed app and see that it's accessing the database. So it's doing this using a connection string stored in the configuration section of the app service. Let's go down to Identity under the Settings grouping, and let's enable a System-Assigned Managed Identity. This will register the app in Microsoft Entra ID, so it can be granted permissions on other Azure services. Once that's done, it has an object ID, but we're actually going to reference this managed identity using the name of the app service. To do that, we need to run some commands on the database server here in Azure. I have SQL Server Management Studio open, and I'm already logged into the remote Azure SQL Database server. It's important to note that I connected using the admin account that's stored in Microsoft Entra ID, not using SQL authentication. In order to grant access to a managed identity, you need to be using an Entra ID account. Let's create a new query on this server, and I'm going to paste in some SQL. The first thing this does is create a user in the database. The name is the name of the app service, which is also the name of the managed identity that was created. And from external provider is telling Azure SQL to look for this in Azure Active Directory. Then it assigns reader, writer, and DDL admin roles to that managed identity. This is right from the documentation, by the way. You might not want to grant this much access, depending on your application's needs. Let's execute this SQL. And there were no errors, so let's go back to the app service in the Azure portal. And let's modify the connection string. Let's edit this existing connection string, the one that's using SQL authentication. I'll paste in some code, and all that's really changed here is the authentication. I've removed the username and password and replaced it with this authentication equals Active Directory default. The database name is the same, and the server information hasn't changed. So let's OK this, and don't forget to save these changes. That's all you need to do. So let's go to Overview and browse to the running application. Now, sometimes it can take a minute or so for these changes to take effect, so you might browse to the site and have no problems, because it's actually still using the old connection information. Then things stop working because you misconfigured the connection string, for example. So give it a minute before testing out the changes, just to be sure. We've got a working connection to the database, and the app service is using a managed identity to authenticate. Next, let's set up a GitHub Actions workflow to deploy code-first migrations to update the database during the code deployments.